At the end of last class, we were looking at the Cold War, and we got as far as early 1950s. Stalin is dead. The new leader, Nikita Khrushchev, takes over. Immediately, tensions between the Russians and the Americans go through the roof, and it's represented in a variety of ways. Increased building of missiles on both sides. Let's see. Well, that's the big one. Increased spying on both sides, with the American spy plane being shot down in 1960, humiliating President Eisenhower, who said he didn't have any spies. And when Kennedy takes power in 1961, the very first thing that he ends up doing is failing in Cuba. The CIA are training anti-Castro Cubans to overthrow the communist Fidel Castro. They fail. Kennedy is asked to send in troops, American troops. He refuses because he's afraid of starting World War III. He is made to look weak. Khrushchev takes the advantage and builds the Berlin Wall to physically separate East and West Berlin in order to strengthen his control over East Berlin and thereby East Germany, essentially forcing Kennedy to try and stop him with American troops stationed in West Berlin. So this is now a functioning video, unless, the world completely sucks, of what actually happened then. Do we have volume? Eventually we'll have volume. There it is.
Early on the morning of August the 20th, 1961, East German soldiers sealed off the line dividing the eastern sector of Berlin from the American, French, and British zones in the west. Building materials were brought out of nearby warehouses, and the notorious Berlin Wall began to take shape, with the great mystification of those on both sides who were soon to be out of sight of each other. The Western powers immediately expressed outrage at this swift and brutal action. The American Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, described the wall as a flagrant violation of the right of free circulation throughout the city, in direct contravention of the four-power agreement reached in Paris in 1949. But it became increasingly obvious there was nothing they could do. As relative was cut off from relative, friend from friend, the pain of it all was quick to spread. But none of this made a dent in the East German government's resolve to go ahead with the wall. They decided to build it to prevent the growing numbers of East Germans from voting with their feet. In other words, fleeing to the West to seek a new life away from the restrictions and disciplines of the communist regime. The wall became a focal point for all that was worst about the Cold War. It became a symbol of a divided world. As a generation grew up behind it over the years, hundreds tried to escape. Through the defenses, over them, under them. The mayor of West Berlin, Willy Brandt, called on the East Berliners to be patient. You cannot be held slaves forever, he told them. But they had to wait for more than a generation for that prophecy to come true.
So people actually woke up one day and there was a wall in the middle of the street in front of them. There was a wall in the middle of the cemetery that they'd gone repeatedly to visit deceased family members. Buildings were boarded up, so you couldn't actually get out of where you were living. You have to find another way out. It was crazy. But this is what they did. Now, the U.S. did nothing, because what were they going to do? They were going to physically stop Russian soldiers from laying this wall. If the Russian soldiers defended themselves, if they exchanged fire, now you have gunfire between Russian soldiers and American soldiers, and then it's World War III. So Khrushchev got away with this, and now it takes us to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which Morgan is going to discuss for us, and then I'll pick up wherever he leaves off. And please speak up.
Everything began on October 14, 1962, when an American U-2 spy plane making a pass over Cuba photographed the Soviet SS-4 medium-range ballistic missile being assembled for installation. President Kennedy was briefed about the situation on October 16, 1962. He and a group called XCOM spent weeks in meetings trying to figure out the best way to solve this problem and avoid war and possibly nuclear exchange. The Soviets and the leader Nikita Khrushchev felt more comfortable having nuclear weapons in Cuba after being targeted by sites in Western Europe and Turkey. They also wanted to stop the U.S. aggression on Cuba after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. At this point, having nuclear weapons only 90 miles south of Florida that could target any city in the eastern U.S. was their biggest fear, so the committee came up with two options. First, to bomb the missile site in a full-scale invasion of Cuba, or second, employ the U.S. Navy to establish a blockade or a quarantine of the island to prevent further deliveries of missiles and military equipment to Cuba. Finally, giving them an ultimatum to remove the existing missiles. He chose the latter and told the American people in a televised press conference of his decision to enact the blockade and made it clear that the U.S. was prepared to use military force to neutralize this threat to national security. This sent a fear across the nation, waiting on the Soviets' response that could result in nuclear war. The tensions between the two superpowers continued for weeks, and they only grew when a Soviet ship bound for Cuba neared the blockade. Thankfully, they stopped short of the line, and there was no attempt to breach the blockade. On October 27, 1962, an American reconnaissance plane was shot down over Cuba, and immediately an invasion force was ready in Florida. At this point, the world felt doomed. Despite their enormous tension between the Soviets and the American leaders, a deal was struck after a few exchanges of letters and communications. Khrushchev promised to remove missiles from Cuba if the U.S. leaders promised not to invade Cuba. He also proposed that the U.S. remove its nuclear arsenal in Turkey, and he will dismantle the missiles in Cuba. The Canadian administration officially accepted the first proposal and privately accepted the second. To help defuse any similar situation in the future, the Americans and the Soviets established a direct hotline between their capitals, Washington and Moscow.
Thank you very much, Morgan. This was the closest after World War II that we came to World War III. We had already placed missiles in Europe and in Turkey bordering the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union decided to retaliate and place missiles in Cuba. But we found out before they could actually fully activate them. And as Morgan tells us, we could have, the Americans, invaded and bombed Cuba, but then we'd be at war because we'd be killing Russian soldiers and allies of the Soviet Union. So, the blockade. Now, what was remarkable about this is that no one felt that Kennedy had the stomach to challenge the Russians. Remember that Winston Churchill and that speech, that the only way to do business with the Russians is if you show them force. They will not listen to negotiation. They don't respect weakness. That was Churchill's advice to the Americans in 1947 when he gave that speech. Kennedy was, as I mentioned, the youngest president ever elected in the United States, the first Catholic president, and he won by a bare majority in the election of 1960. The assumption was he was weak, especially after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, and yet he went on television, and I'm not going to play the video because I don't want to run out of time, but he went on television and he publicly said, the Russians have lied. We asked them, are you putting missiles in Cuba? They said no. We have proof they are. So we are now encircling Cuba with the U.S. Navy. If they cross that line, that is considered an international act of war. And they're going to start World War III. So essentially, it was a game of chicken. He told the Russians, your move. Either back down or start war. But brilliantly, he also, as Morgan said, he gave Khrushchev a secret way out. You pull your missiles out of Cuba, we'll pull ours out of Turkey. It was so that Khrushchev could go back to Russia and say, I got something for us. I'm just not giving in everything. Of course, that was a bit of a game. because the Americans were going to pull their missiles out of Turkey anyway because they were outmoded. But it was a brilliant political move to allow the Russians to back down and save us from World War III. So let me push forward. But it doesn't end there. The tension just keeps going up and up and up, and now we finally get to Vietnam. Okay, I won't take anything away from Ramir, but get ready, you're next. Vietnam, just south of China. In the 19th century, when the Americans and the Western European nations were pushing into the Chinese economy, they were pushing into the Japanese economy, never formally conquering each nation and colonizing it, but just dominating it economically and politically. They were also, in fact, colonizing East Asian nations as they would eventually colonize all of Africa, or most of Africa. The French colonized Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. They were there starting 1887. They were kicked out when the Japanese defeated the French, both in Europe and in East Asia. After the Japanese were defeated at the end of World War II, the French wanted their empire back, but the big difference was now the Vietnamese people had been well organized to resist. Wait a second, is somebody doing Ho Chi Minh today?
Yeah.
Who? That's it. Under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh, the leader of the Vietnamese Communist Party. So, yes?
Ho Chi Minh,
Take it away, Ramir.
Ho Chi Minh was a Vietnamese communist revolutionary leader who was a prime minister from 1945 to 1955 and president from 1945 to 1969 of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, not Vietnam. He was a key figure in the foundation of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in 1945, as well as the People's Army of Vietnam and the Viet Cong. During the Vietnam War, he led the Viet Minh independence movement from 1921 onward, establishing the communist-ruled Democratic Republic of Vietnam in 1945 and defeating the French Union in 1954 at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. He officially stepped down from power in 1965 due to health problems, but remained a highly visible figurehead and inspiration for those Vietnamese fighting for his cause, a united communist Vietnam until his death. After the war, Saigon, the former capital of the Republic of Vietnam, was renamed Ho Chi Minh City. However, the name Saigon is still very popular.
Okay.
He was also in the U.S.
What?
He was in the U.S. like in 1917 in New York.
He traveled everywhere, that guy.
Yeah.
He traveled everywhere. He was incredibly well educated. So, Ho Chi Minh was a brilliant leader because he brought together for the first time the Vietnamese people to resist the French, and he was successful. His forces defeated the French at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in a formal military conflict, not a guerrilla war. But thereafter, the Americans couldn't let it go. Because if China fell to communism in 1949, North Korea was communist after 1945, if Vietnam goes, Laos, Cambodia, the dominoes will keep falling, and then all of East Asia will fall to communism, just like all of East Europe fell to communism. So the Americans who had supported the French, once the French army was defeated, stepped in. They established and forced the establishment of the Republic of South Vietnam, which was anti-communist, supported by American funding, American military training, etc. And this temporary division of North and South, communist and anti-communist, was temporary. There were supposed to be elections so that all the Vietnamese people could decide, what do you want to live under, communism or not? The elections were never held. And the Republic of South Vietnam kept getting a lot of American money and weaponry and advisors in training in order to resist the spread of communism in South Vietnam. Ramir referred to the Viet Minh, which were the party, the communists in the north, and the Viet Cong, which were the communists in the south. In the south, the Viet Cong operated in secret, trying to undermine the Republic of South Vietnam. And this is what the Americans were fighting or helping to fight against. In 1961, when Kennedy takes over, he sees that America is getting deeper and deeper involved in Vietnam, and he sees that it's not helping. The more money that gets put into Vietnam, South Vietnam, the more advisors the Americans send over to train the South Vietnamese army, the less capable they are of quelling the spread of communism in South Vietnam. Mostly because the government of South Vietnam, led by President Diem, who is Catholic, in a majority Buddhist country, has decided to persecute Buddhists. But that is the majority religion in his country. So he has no friends. The country becomes increasingly unstable, and in 1963, President Kennedy discovers there is a plot to kill President Diem by his own military leaders. He doesn't stop it because he needs Vietnam stabilized so he can get Americans out of Vietnam. At this point, there's only 11,000 advisors, but there's a whole lot of money getting poured into the country. Kennedy doesn't believe in this crazy, if Vietnam falls, the rest of East Asia falls. He doesn't believe in it. He wants to get America out of Vietnam. This is September. But in November 22nd, 1963, Kennedy is assassinated. The very first thing that his successor, President Lyndon Baines Johnson, does is drastically increase the American commitment to Vietnam. Because he believes in this domino theory, that if you don't stop the spread of communism, it'll take over the whole world. So from 11,000 advisors, the United States now has 500,000 troops in Vietnam by 1968. The Navy is patrolling the rivers of Vietnam and the coast. Infantry are on the ground along with the Marines. And the Air Force is bombing the bejesus out of strategic targets and the demilitarized zone between North and South, trying to stop the flow of supplies from North to South Vietnam. Now, throughout this time, the American military and the American public, the American government and the American military kept telling the American public, we are winning this war. Look at how many Vietnamese we are killing. Thus, we are winning this war. Until February 1968, Lorenzo, everybody put your phones away for the love of Jesus. Do we have to pretend like we're in kindergarten every bloody class? February 1968, the Viet Cong in South Vietnam unleash a surprise offensive called the Tet Offensive, which Ramir, you've got something for us? Go. What is it? Or tell me whatever you got.
The Tet Offensive, basically, like you said, was a surprise offensive that is considered one of the largest military campaigns of the Vietnam War. Launched on January 30, 1968, by forces of the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army against the forces of South Vietnam and the U.S. and their allies. It was a campaign of surprise attack against military and civilian commands and control centers throughout South Vietnam. Although the offensive was a military defeat for the communism, it had a profound effect on the U.S. government and shocked the U.S. public, which had been led to believe that by its top political and military leaders that the communists were due to previous defeats incapable of launching such massive efforts. Basically, they saw that communist people actually could fight back, and they're actually smart.
After years of being told, we're winning, we're winning, we're winning, when they least expected, the forces of communism in Vietnam launch an offensive and nearly overrun American forces. This is all caught on television. After February 1968, nobody could believe the government when they said we're winning this, and certainly nobody could believe the military. That year, President Johnson, who had brought us the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, as well as affirmative action, refused to run for a second term as president because he knew he had lost all credibility with the American people. The Democrats couldn't really put up a strong enough candidate, and Richard Nixon, who Kennedy had beaten in 1960, comes back, runs for president with a secret war to a secret plan to end the war, which he never told anybody of because he had a secret plan. Nixon takes power in 68, and Nixon, his plan was essentially to bomb the bejesus out of American enemies and force them to make peace, as well as to strengthen the army of South Vietnam so that eventually American forces could come out. Now, this bombing of North Vietnam also spread into the neighboring countries of Laos and Cambodia, where supplies were being transported into and then into South Vietnam. This is what the U.S. bombing of Vietnam looked like. So what you saw there is two types of bombing. The more strategic type of bombing, where you bomb bridges and roads, etc., which is just conventional, high explosive ordnance. But the other part was the flames. That was purposely used, napalm, to set fire to forests where the enemy was hiding and knew the forests and the paths much better than the Americans did. So how to defeat the enemy that hid in the forest? Just set fire to them, burn them alive while in the forest. The American people found out about this, the extent of this bombing, and also the secret expansion of this bombing, because the media had not unfettered access, but much more access to the battleground than they do today. And this unleashed a wave of anti-war protests in this country. Eventually, however, Nixon did force the North Vietnamese to stop fighting and sign a peace treaty, partly because of this intensified bombing and partly because of secret diplomatic negotiations I'll talk about in a minute. When they finally pull U.S. troops out of out of South Vietnam in 1975, this was based on a promise that the North would respect the independence of South Vietnam. But as soon as the Americans left, the North invaded South Vietnam, unified Vietnam for the first time since 1954, and imposed communism throughout the country. Now, the funny thing is, after all this fighting, Americans lost 55,000 soldiers, airmen, and sailors in the Vietnam War. Every name is inscribed on the Vietnam War Memorial wall in D.C. If you don't know what I'm talking about, just Google it. There is a wall that in the marble is inscribed the name and I think the unit and where the person was from who died in the Vietnam War, all 55,000 of them. Okay? The Vietnamese lost 5 million. 5 million civilians and soldiers in a war that lasted from 1945 through 1975. Okay? 5 million civilians and soldiers. After all that, what is Vietnam today? Still a communist nation, but it has opened up its doors to the world. Tourists flock to Vietnam, just like tourists, not American tourists as much, flock to Cuba. All that foreign capitalist money is welcomed in Vietnam. After all that fighting and all that dying, Vietnam is slowly becoming a part of the global international economic community. So what is the moral of all that? sometimes all that fighting and dying doesn't really change anything. But, all right. In the 1960s and 70s, the tension is going up and up and up. We're on the verge of World War III after the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Americans and the Russians, as Morgan said, they establish a hotline between Moscow and D.C. so that we don't end up nearly blowing each other to smithereens. Some other things that took place in the 1960s were a variety of treaties to lessen the amount of building and testing of nuclear weapons, and slowly détente set in, a warming of the Cold War, a realization by the Russians and the Americans that they couldn't keep playing chicken because eventually somebody was going to do something stupid. All right? How did this détente, this improving of relations, come to an end? Before I get there, I want to point out something about Nixon. Nixon was a fairly dishonest politician. He terrorized his political opponents. He spied on his political opponents. But the one thing that he did, which was fairly brilliant, he had a reputation as being a very strong anti-communist fighter. But he recognized in 1972 that communism was not going to go anywhere. You had to make peace with these people. Otherwise, you could have trouble, economic, political, whatever. The Communist Party had taken over China in 1949. Between 1949 and 1972, the Americans refused to accept that the Communist Party of China was the legitimate government of China. So there was no economic, there was no trade, diplomatic relations. It was increasingly impossible because China was this huge country. They possessed the hydrogen bomb. They were increasing the size of their military. They could no longer be ignored. Nixon had, not he himself, but also his advisors, had a fairly brilliant idea. Everyone has been operating under the assumption that the Chinese and the Russians, because they're both run by communists, must also be friendly and allies. They're not. Nixon and his advisors recognized the Chinese and the Russians have a long common border. They have been enemies for hundreds of years before they both became communists. And they are still tense neighbors today. So why not go to China, make peace with them, and then use that to go to Russia and put pressure on the Russians to essentially compete for American favor? And this is what Nixon did. He went to China in 1972 and said, we recognize China, the Chinese Communist Party, as the legitimate government of China. We will open up trade with China. We will exchange diplomatic ties. We will bring you into the community of nations. This set in motion, essentially, the China becoming virtually a capitalist nation today, and them owning most of our debt, and I guess us on some level. Having done that, he went to Russia and he said to the leader of the Russian Communist Party, we have made peace with China, your enemy. What are you willing to do to preserve our friendship? And the Russians said, okay, we'll put pressure on North Vietnam to stop fighting. And they did. And that's how we basically got out of Vietnam. Because this guy, Nixon, who was known as the strongest anti-communist in the history of anti-communism, realized you can't do that anymore. You have to deal with the politics as they exist in front of you. So how did détente, the warming of relations between communist and non-communist countries, come to an end? Two things, both of them in the Middle East. First off, the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. Kevin, you're up next. What happened? Israel was founded in 1948. The independent state of Israel, a Jewish homeland, for the first time since, well, the biblical time, was there an independent Jewish homeland. Okay? What was the problem? Well, in the meantime, there were many, many Arabs and Muslims living in Palestine that the Jews now claimed as their ancestral biblical homeland. Fine. What happened? The territory was split by the United Nations. Israel was created right here in orange, and the yellow was reserved as Palestine, an Arab homeland. But the surrounding Arab nations felt this was essentially a land grab, land theft, throwing people, Arabs, out of their home and Palestinians that had lived there for generations for the Jews. And there unleashed the Mideast crisis between the Jews and the Arabs, where the Jews were fighting for a homeland and felt we had been here since biblical times, and the Arabs and Muslims claimed, well, we've been here since the year 700 and change. So who was here first? Who was here now? After a while, it didn't matter because the killing had gotten so out of control. And so there was the War of 1948, where Israel won that war, and we know that because Israel still exists today. They had another war in 50, I don't know why I always forget this, 56, 68, and then 73. Each time, the idea was to defeat Israel and to wipe it off the face of the map. Each time the Israelis won. And by the early 1970s, Israel had become a firm American ally in the Middle East. But just like what was happening in the Cold War elsewhere, a nation had to make a decision. Either it was allied with the Americans or allied with the Russians or the communists. So if Israel was allied with the Americans, the surrounding Arab nations found their support amongst the Russians in this expanding Cold War. When the Arab nations were defeated in the War of 1973, they took as retribution, they took as their retribution, freezing the global economy in the OPEC oil crisis that Kevin's going to tell us about.
The OPEC oil crisis was an imposed embargo against the United States in retaliation for the U.S. decision to resupply the Israelis military and to gain leverage in the post-war peace negotiations. They also extended the embargo to countries that supported Israel, including the Netherlands, Portugal, and South Africa. In 1973, the oil embargo injured the U.S. economy, which had grown dependent on foreign oil. President Nixon's administration attempted to end the embargo, only signaled a complex shift in the global financial balance of power to oil-producing states. In 1973, OPEC had demanded that foreign oil corporations increase prices and cede greater shares of revenue to their local subsidiaries. By that time, the Nixon administration announced a new energy strategy to boost domestic production to reduce U.S. vulnerability to oil imports and ease the burden of nationwide fuel shortage. By the fall of 1973, the prices per oil barrel doubled, then quadrupled, imposing high costs of consumers and structural challenges to the stability of the world national economies.
Thank you. So just in case the numbers didn't sort of set in 1973, the Arab nations organized an OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, stopped selling oil to America and some of its key allies, which means the price of gas at the station first doubled, then quadrupled, as Kevin was saying, which meant gas was in short supply, prices went through the roof, cars were lining up at gas stations. All right? Google some photos of 1973 oil crisis and you will see videos of simply cars lining up at gas stations. All right? But in addition to that, it wasn't just people couldn't get around in their cars anymore, but the basic oil that the American economy depended on, factories, homes, heating, etc., became too expensive. And when costs go up like that, profits go down, the economy stagnates. So the combination of the oil crisis and the cost of the Vietnam War, in addition to greater economic competition globally, the American economy that had been growing by leaps and bounds since World War II skidded to a halt in the 1970s. All right? So, why did this happening in the Middle East, specifically Israel/Palestine, destroy relations between America and Russia? America had supported Israel, the Russians supported the Arab states, and the Americans felt that this OPEC strike was somehow being engineered by the Russians in a grand Cold War strategy of attacking America and its economic and political interests. The next thing that really killed détente took place in Iran, all right, and neighboring Afghanistan. So here's Iraq, where obviously we were doing our fighting. Here's Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, Iran right in the middle. Now, in the 1950s, the CIA had engineered the overthrow of Prime Minister Mossadegh in Iran, suspected of being too left-leaning, too close to the Russians, too sympathetic to socialism. And the fear was, once he took power, he would push out all the foreign companies that had developed the oil fields in Iran. All right? In his place, the American CIA had placed the Shah of Iran, a very Western-oriented, conservative, basically dictator. The combination of his pro-Western lifestyle alienated religious fundamentalists in Iran who felt he was the exact opposite of what a conservative Muslim should be. Plus, it also alienated the many, many Iranians who were sick of being ruled by what was considered to be an American puppet. In 1979, the Shah of Iran is overthrown in the Iranian Revolution by fundamentalist Muslim revolutionaries. In that revolution, about 100, I think it was 100 American hostages were taken, seized from the American embassy in Tehran. They were held hostage for, no, it wasn't 100 hostages. It was something like 20 hostages. They were held for about 170 days. And every single day that those Americans were held hostage by the new fundamentalist religious leadership in Iran was a humiliation to the Americans because they couldn't get them back. They tried militarily, that failed. They tried diplomatically, that failed. Eventually, they were spirited out through the aid of, wait for it, Canada. Now, great movie came out last year called Argo with Ben Affleck. He produced it. Watch it. Now, how does this have anything to do with America and Russia? Nothing yet, except for the fact that the Americans have now lost access to Iranian oil because an enemy government is in control of Iran, right? In 1970, the Soviet Union up here invades Afghanistan, and they impose a communist government. So now the Americans are feeling pinched. You've got the OPEC oil crisis. Fuel is expensive, and it's still expensive by 1979. And in 1979, they lose access to Iranian oil, and the Soviets have taken over neighboring Afghanistan. And here's the Persian Gulf, where all the ships carrying the majority of the world's oil picks up its oil and then sails out to the rest of the world. The Americans feel like their access to this oil-producing region is coming to an end, and the Soviets are behind it. And thus we have the election of Ronald Reagan. Jennifer, take it away. Ronald Reagan, what do you got?
Ronald Reagan was born February 6, 1911, and he died June 5, 2004. He was the 40th President of the United States. He was in office from January 20, 1981 to January 20, 1989. He was a Republican. Before he became president, he was a radio broadcaster, and then he became an actor. Following, he became a spokesman for General Electric. As a president, he implemented the creating political and economic reform and to reduce taxes. During his first term, he announced a new war on drugs and ordered an invasion of Grenada.
An invasion of Grenada? Yes.
Yeah. Furthermore, when he got elected for a second term, he decided to focus on foreign matters, like ending the Cold War. He planted the Soviet Union as an evil, or he pointed out the Soviet Union as an evil empire. Ronald Reagan supported anti-communist movements worldwide. He worked to build a massive military with the USSR. Before Reagan left office in 1989, he negotiated with the Soviet General Secretary to decrease both of the country's nuclear
Arsenals.
arsenal, which then led to the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union.
Thank you. Let me pick it up from there. Ronald Reagan, as Jennifer said, was an actor. But he was an actor at a time when most actors were considered to be sympathetic to left-wing political movements. Hollywood, liberal, they must all be Democrats or secretly communists. At that time, at the height of anti-communism in America, Reagan publicly came out as a strong supporter of anti-communists, and he was very cooperative in the search for secret communists in Hollywood. Okay? Now, eventually, he became governor of California in the 60s and ran for president in the 70s, lost, ran again against Jimmy Carter, and won. Jimmy Carter was hobbled by the OPEC oil crisis. He was hobbled by his failure to rescue the hostages in Iran. He was hobbled by his inability to bring back the American economy to the glories of the 1960s and 50s. But Reagan said, you elect me, I'm going to spend so much on the military, I'm going to bankrupt the Russians and end the Cold War, and I'm also going to cut taxes to revive the economy. Because Reagan famously said, government is not the solution to your problems, government is the problem. Too much regulation, too much taxation, too much getting in your way. The exact opposite of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal that said government is the answer to the problem by regulating capitalism, by taxing you and distributing the income to people who need it most. We are now living in the hangover of Reaganism. Now, he also, as Jennifer said, funded anti-communist movements, which meant the Mujahideen in Afghanistan got American funding and weaponry. He also supported the Contras in Nicaragua, the El Salvadorian government. These were brutal regimes that he was supporting against communism. The irony is, the Mujahideen that were supported in Afghanistan eventually gave birth to the Taliban, that gave safe harbor to Osama bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda movement. So this idea of chickens coming home to roost is actually more than a cliche. And so the Russians have to make a decision. Do we match American military spending, or do we not, and find a way to end this ruinous arms race? And they appoint Mikhail Gorbachev, the new Secretary General of the Soviet Communist Party. Robert, tell me about Gorbachev. I wish I had a picture of the guy, but I ran out of time.
Gorbachev was born on the 2nd of March of 1931. He's 83 years old. This is unique because he was the only leader of the Soviet Union born after the October Revolution. He joined the Communist Party in the early 1950s while he was in college. In 1955, he graduated from Moscow State University, at which point he started working within the Communist Party. His political career took off in 1970 with his being appointed first party secretary of Stavropol Kaikon. In 1974, he was the first secretary of the Soviet. In 1979, he was appointed to the Politburo, and in 1985 was elected general secretary of the Communist Party. He is best known for his reform initiatives, Perestroika and Glasnost. Perestroika meaning restructuring, and Glasnost openness. Under Glasnost, there was a less censure of press and literature, and there was more freedom of speech. Under Perestroika, he was trying to restructure the Soviet Union so it could become more democratic. Under those, lesser known would be like Democracia, the democratization of Eastern Europe, and Usporovenia, the acceleration of economic development. As Jennifer mentioned, he was known for meeting with Ronald Reagan during the 80s to talk about to usher a new era of détente, to lessen nuclear weaponry. He was the one who suggested that both the U.S. and USSR reduce their nuclear weapons by half in the 80s and hopefully eliminate nuclear weapons by the year 2000. He withdrew troops from Afghanistan and Mongolia under his leadership. In 1988, he abandoned the Brezhnev Doctrine, allowing for Eastern European governments to be decided by democratic elections, allowing for the dismantling of the USSR. In 1991, he oversaw the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the establishment of the Russian Federation under Boris Yeltsin. And in the 90s, he partnered with Pizza Hut. In 2007, he was part of Gucci, Louis Vuitton, and famous adverts, and when he's in the limousine driving by the Berlin Wall and famously saying, "I gave the people what they wanted, and they wanted consumerism."
Very good. Very good. Very good way to end all this. Now, so since he's already talked about this, let's push forward. The one thing I want to emphasize is this. In order to save money, besides pulling out of Afghanistan, besides demobilizing the Soviet army, reducing its size, he stopped funding communist states in Eastern Europe, Cuba, which is why Cuba is such a great tourist destination, because they no longer have Russian money to depend on. East Europe fell, and eventually Germany, which had been divided, was reunified in 1990. And this is what I want to leave you with, an ABC News story on the reunification of Germany.
From ABC, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings, reporting tonight from Berlin.
From the Berlin Wall specifically, take a look at them. They've been there since last night. They are here in the thousands. They are here in the tens of thousands. Occasionally they shout, "Die Mauer muss weg, the wall must go." Thousands and thousands of West Germans come to make the point that the wall has suddenly become irrelevant. Something, as you can see, almost to party on. How do you measure such an astonishing moment in history? The East German government said tonight they were going to make more openings in the wall, at least a dozen more. Put bulldozers right through the wall so that more people could cross to the west. The East German communist leadership tonight said there'd be a new election law guaranteeing secret elections which the rest of the world could monitor. And only 24 hours after East Germans were told they could go anywhere, anytime, the Soviet Union said that was a sensible move. Thousands of East Germans came across the border today, perhaps more than 100,000, so many that border police lost count. And at every border crossing, thousands of West Germans there to say welcome. Some of the really good news today was for the East German government. While thousands and thousands came to look, even gape at this showcase of capitalism, the vast majority said they would be going back. The simple act of giving people the freedom to travel may have convinced East Germans they need not take flight whenever the door opens just a fraction. It has been an astonishing day. Hour after hour, all through today, thousands and thousands of West Germans have come to the wall to see for themselves, to climb up on this hideous structure, to finally look down at what has been no man's land for so long. Finally, after all these years, to say in person what they think of the East German border guards, or try to make friends. Suddenly a flashback to what it was like for so long. A young man in the East makes a dash for the wall. They catch him and take him away. Presumably he should have used a legal border crossing. Only a couple of years ago, he might have been shot. Not today. Today it was possible to have a dialogue. Your government seems to be changing every day. Where do you think it's going? That's the government's problem, he says, not mine. Such an astonishing moment in history. Sam, what's it feel like to be standing on top of the wall?
It's incredible for me. It's I can't describe really my feelings. It's something unreal for me.
So the wall that had been put up separating families for generations, that any attempt at crossing it, digging under it, or just trying to get through it would have ended up with you being shot by border guards. When it came open in 1989, people were actually on top of this wall singing, and this went on for days and days. If you go to Berlin today, all you see is just the footprint of where the wall used to be, and you can only imagine what it must have been like for this vibrant city to be cut in half the way that it was. So thank you. I will see you this Wednesday. If you got anything to hand in, hand it on your way out, please.